Hello and welcome to episode 3 of my Kerbal Career. Now, when I loaded up the save, I had 2 flights in orbit. Now, I know flags took one, but I didn't know what the other one was. So, that's what we're actually going to be doing this episode, is dealing with the second problem. And the second problem, or the second flight, is this guy, Dudgan Kerman. And he's been stuck around orbiting Kerbin for 56 days and 1 hour. That is when he was discovered. He was discovered on day 11, and it's, I think, day 67 in these games save. And we need to rescue him. My guess as to why Dudgan Kerman hasn't actually died, even though I have TAC life support installed, is because since I've never actually activated him, he's never loaded himself into the game. Meaning that TAC life support probably still isn't aware that he's existent and he needs to consume food, simply because he's never been loaded. Now, the second I actually get within a kilometer or so of him, then he's going to become loaded into the game, and that's when I'm going to have a limited amount of time to get him into a vessel with food before he dies of lack of oxygen and or electric charge. Anyhow, we have some tech that's going to be done which will give us new parts since we are lacking some. And I've got a couple vessels, such as a rescue ship, which is going to be our next vessel that's going to be done. And this one says it's going to take 65 days. It's just at a much slower rate. It's really only going to take about 12 once it bumps it up to the first. So let's warp to complete this. And moving right to the launch pad, you can see I'm using Ship Manifest to remove Jebediah from the cockpit, seeing as how if I have Jebediah in there, then I can't rescue Dudgan. Meaning, only one of them would be able to return alive, whereas the other one would be forced to die. As you can see, I've set my target, and I'm just waiting for Dudgan to be in the right spot for me to launch. Now, I know now I should have launched earlier. However, I end up being a little short and just having to do a Hoffman transfer to get to Dudgan. Another thing you might notice is I have a lot more parachutes on this vessel. That's because I'm trying to utilize stage recovery a little bit more. Mostly so that I can actually recover some of these parts, since quite a few of them do cost a lot of funds, as well as if I get the parts back, then I can very easily reuse them for Kerbal construction time. But you can see here now that I am quite a bit short from actually rendezvousing from that launch. So I'm just going to go initially above his orbit, and then when I get to the periapsis I'm going to go below it, so I'm going slower when I go above his orbit, and then I go faster than him, meaning I'll catch up to him when I finally get to my periapsis, once I'm in orbit. And of course, we'll be doing this a lot more once I start building my space station, because we're going to need to do a lot of rendezvousing. And I'm just correcting my plane because it's a little bit off. That way, any little bit of distance we can get to Dudgan would be ideal, because once we get close enough to him, he's going to load into the world, and he's actually going to start needing resources in order to stay alive. So I'm just tweaking my orbit here to try and get an encounter as soon as I can. So we're just chasing Dudgan right now, slowly catching up to him, at least until the point that we can do our Hoffman transfer, where we just basically go up to his orbit, or at least close enough. So we have our first encounter coming up with Dudgan, and we're going to try to switch to him when we need to bring him toward our vessel, since he's a little bit more maneuverable than the ship. Now I'm burning toward him, and also similarly in the direction he's traveling, as to make it so my relative velocity to the target, which is Dudgan, goes down. As you can see, I just burn in pretty much whichever direction is going to lower that. Of course, you can predict this slightly. Now I need to stage out so I can get my smaller engine working, and we get our relative velocity below 40 meters per second. And the more similar we make it to 0, the closer we end up getting to him. As you can see, now it's down to about 30, and we're almost right on top of him. But he loaded in the world, so all of his food, water, oxygen, and electric charge has been depleted, which means we need to get him in the vessel on this encounter. If we don't, he's going to starve to death in space. So I take control of Dudgan because, like I said, he's more maneuverable than the ship, just because I don't have to turn him around. I can just use his EVA monopropellant. And I bring him toward my ship. And of course, almost have the velocities matched, so now I can just kind of dock him. And I need to hurry up because I'm not sure how long he can survive without any electric charge. And then the game trolls me, as Dudgan is helplessly spinning out of control away from his own safety to where he can finally eat and breathe again. At this point, I was actually worried that Dudgan was going to die seconds before I got him into the spacecraft. However, with a little bit of luck and changing the camera, I'm able to reorient Dudgan so that he can actually grab onto the ladder without being thrown around like a rag doll. And we get him into the vessel after attempting to gather science. And now Dudgan can breathe again, and he can even eat some. And after 63 days of helplessly floating in orbit, Dudgan has finally been rescued, and we will be able to complete a contract with rescuing him. So it's time to go back to Kerbin, where Dudgan can rejoice in the fact he no longer has to orbit Kerbin in his EVA suit. And we also get to add him to our stock of kerbals. I'm not sure if we should classify them as tools or living beings, since many will die in this mission we have to explore the universe. And by universe, I mean solar system, because I see a lot of stars in the background and we can't go to them yet. Anyhow, we are beginning our descent and I am aiming for that peninsula right there. So I will be firing my engine very violently. And if you think about it, in the idea of chemistry, hydrogen and oxygen burning together or with a spark to start the reaction is a very, very violent and volatile reaction. I'm using volatile in a non-chemistry term, but it's a very violent reaction with how the two actually mix to make water, which is of course what the rocket engines would be exhausting if the liquid fuel is indeed hydrogen. And I don't believe the oxidizer can be anything but oxygen. So there we go. We have successfully saved our Kerbal, and because we can, how about we grab some science? Nice surface sample for literally no science, as well as that won't even give us any. So we can just grab back on, jump in, and recover. So we were only able to recover a minimal amount of science, only 4.9 for this mission. However, we did recover a lot of parts, and we got a decent bit of funding back. But mostly it's the parts so that we can reduce our construction time for vessels in the future. And most of them are just small little things rather than giant boosters. You even get some back. Now this is what I'm talking about just because I want to mention this because I mentioned it before. When you look at liquid fuel, like quantity, 97.18 unit value is 0.74, so we get 71.44 funds in return. Now, things like ore from extraplanetary launch pads or Kethane from the Kethane mod, if you start your vessel with 0 of this and you go and mine it, and then you recover your vessel, then you're actually going to get the money back for the extra liquid or ore that you mined. Meaning that if you launch just a tank with an engine on it and you recover all of the components, like an SSTO, except you bring back, 2,000 units of Kethane, you're going to actually make money. And I've tested this, and it does work. So it's something that I'll keep in mind. And I want to mention 1.5 reputation for bringing back someone that was stranded for so long. You'd think it'd be like a big celebration, everyone cheering, "Yay, he's finally back." But no, 1.5 reputation. I've gotten more from just Jebediah sitting on the launch pad, grabbing a couple science and then me recovering it without actually launching. Okay, so I made literally the most basic vessel that I can, and I'm not even going to give it a name because it's only made of 3 parts. And it's going to 2 contracts for me. Now, since I researched a couple more tech nodes, I have 2 more upgrade points that I am just going to spend on actually build time, because I want to try to make so my build time is a little more reasonable. Now, these, from what I've been able to figure out, are actually going to start costing less early on. For example, I believe the first one's going to cost like 4 or 6 science, and then it doubles every single time you buy one. That way, early game you can actually buy some points, and late game you have a much harder time buying them, whereas late game with funds, you can just spam that button as much as you want. Like, I could buy 2 right now if I wanted, but that's kind of expensive. And back on the launchpad, we have our 3-part vessel. That will be completing 2 contracts for us. Now we just need to right-click the Yawlmaster and click Run Test to complete the first contract. And the second contract is the small engine on the bottom of this vessel, which we will be gathering our liquid fuel from the Yawlmaster, which is why we only need 3 parts and no actual fuel tank. Now what's impressive about the Freya engine is, though it's very small, it has quite a bit of thrust, meaning that we can actually lift this vessel off and go a decent distance. However, there's no need, since we just need to test it while landed. And of course, we can recover all of these parts to be used later. And of course, we get 0.1 science for recovering a vessel that survived a flight, as well as getting our 3 parts back with almost all the funds, whereas the first one was 600 and the Yawlmaster was 1200, but most of the value back. And of course, we get our 2 kerbals back that, remember, from that simple little launch that we had right there that just took a couple of seconds, where they barely took off the launch pad, their return gives us more reputation than a kerbal who was stuck in orbit for over 2 months. These Jebediah and Bill are truly heroes for getting reputation that simply and that easily. Whereas Dudgan, he has to work to get his reputation. Hopefully in later episodes we will see him redeem himself. Well, now that we have our probe launcher nice and constructed, I'm going to launch it. And do note, just launch really quickly. Usually I have to select my crew. I don't have to select my crew when I'm launching just probes. Only when you actually have crew pods do you actually have to select crew. So the big reveal on my probe launcher, and this probe launcher is designed to launch 2 probes, one to the moon and one to Minmus. Hopefully I'll be able to get there. These have over 1600 delta V each for the little things, plus this launch stage has an engine in the very center that is actually the designed engine to cart them to the moon, and then hopefully start its trip to Minmus. SAS on, throttle up even though it's solid rocket boosters, and fire. Now the SRBs are a little bit wobbly, but that's just because I don't use too many struts. I just have a couple holding these 2 together because they're awful if you do not put struts trying to hold them together. Now of course the SRBs are the first stage to drop once they're out, and then we have 4 liquid fuel engines on the outside that will fire, and then they should get me into orbit, and then I'll have a center engine that I can use for transferring. Of course, everything has some real shoot parachutes on top as to recover them, because each of these solid rocket boosters are around 600 funds, and if I recover them, then I can get parachutes back, plus them back in the part inventory, so next time I build them, it's at a significant discount. So, speeding things along, we stage out our solid rocket boosters, and one of them actually gets destroyed, so I'll only be able to recover 3 at maximum. And we have what I'm going to have to say is my favorite engine so far that I've been able to unlock in this career save, which are the ones I'm using, because they have such nice bluish kind of leading into purple particle effects. I believe that was added with the Rapier engine in the 2.22 update or 0.23. Whenever the Rapier engine was added, I believe that visual was also implemented for mod authors to start using. Now, one of the problems I always seem to have with my craft, and the reason I need to consistently add advanced SAS, is I build crafts that are very top-heavy, And I probably shouldn't, but it's just the way I kind of design them. Like, I design, okay, what do we want this to do? And then I start building under it. And typically that leads the top to just be really imbalanced. But my plan here is to get my encounter with the moon, drop one of the probes so that we'll be en route to enter the moon's sphere of influence, and then take the other probe and just go straight to Minmus from wherever the moon was. And for the most part, I get this to work pretty well, actually. As you can see, I'm getting my moon encounter, trying to put the periapsis pretty low, less than 100 kilometers, and from there I create a second maneuver node and just start playing with it. Aha! We have an encounter with Minmus 19 days away if we do this way, which is actually very nice. So I am probably going to be doing this, and I'll leave that maneuver node, of course, for my smaller vessel. 2 days, that one is in 1 day. So looks like we're going to start using this. Now you can see I've set up a Duna, Kerbal to Duna, because I think I'd be able to make that transfer window. But with Kerbal construction time, I'm not sure, because those days are just dwindling down ever so quickly. Now I want one to the maneuver node, and I want a second one to the sphere of influence node, so that I have all the timers I need. So I have reached my maneuver node, and it is time to decouple one of these probes so that they can start heading toward the moon. And that one's going to go straight into the moon's sphere of influence, which means I'm going to need to use my second node, which I have right there, for getting the second probe out to Minmus. So we have the Kerbal alarm clock just letting me know that my node is a minute away. So I'm going to face in the proper direction. This is a 406 meters per second delta V burn, and it was atrocious to do since the vessel was so off balance. But I found out as long as I stayed below a fifth of my thrust, then I was able to control it with the help of SAS and that reaction wheel I have below my main launcher. Now, if you're paying attention, the UI started to tweak out a little bit here. If you've noticed, it's flickering. And I have no idea why it was starting to do that. However, it did force me to restart my game. And once I did, as you can see, it fixed itself, and I was able to finish my burn. I just needed 1.5 meters per second more in the direction I was already heading prograde in order to get my encounter with Minmus. And back onto the first probe, we are going to be just waiting for us to reach the periapsis. Okay, so now that we are in the moon sphere of influence, I actually need to make this a polar orbit. Mostly so that I can scan the entire surface of the moon with this one probe without needing to launch multiple, since a polar orbit will theoretically hit every spot, even though it's not exactly the case. Like, of course I'm going to miss some of the hexagons with the Kethane map, but I'll get most of them with the polar orbit, well, at least a lot more than with an equatorial orbit. So I'm just going to do that now, get my periapsis at about 60 or so. As you can see, there is Kethane there, as well as on the northern side of the hemisphere. So we will definitely look into some of these locations to see what's good for mining. I'll probably send small rover probes just to make sure that they're any good, because if it's going to be awful terrain, then I'm not going to land there. I can't make much of a mining operation and or base if the terrain is awful. So this probe is all set. This one is still going to be probably, I think, 16 days. So, let's go take a look at that new vessel I've been designing. And here it is, the brand new Lunar Lander. Actually, no, this is designed to create or do a couple of contracts. The first being test the jet engine on the bottom, and the second being test these hydraulic decouplers at about between 9,000 and 16,000 meters. And this is just to get those two done so I can get enough science to start unlocking one more piece of tech before I wait the additional 7 days past the day of this launch in Kerbal Space Program to complete my real lunar lander. So, as you can see, we're heading up, and I know I've already gone past the altitude limit. That's because in order to be going fast enough, I need to go past the altitude limit, turn the ship around, and then start even using the jet engine to push myself down faster. Since going against gravity with only a couple air intakes, the one jet engine won't give me enough thrust to get at least 480 meters per second to complete the hydraulic decouplers. So if I use gravity to assist me, then I get enough speed, and of course I can pop the parachutes, and we can just gently fall down and recover our vessel. So the science that I wanted to gather was specialized construction. That way I can get docking ports and start building either space stations or very long space trains so that I can do long distance travel and cart a lot of stuff around attached together, seeing as how launching stuff limits me to the size of the vessel that I can build.
And our second half of the probe launcher has finally made it to Minmus. So we can close the alarm, and here we are with our sphere of influence changed to Minmus. However, we are going to have to slow down significantly if we want to be captured. So that is, this needs to update. That's the strangest maneuver node orientation I have seen. Come on, update. There we go. Sometimes you have to go a little bit past the sphere of influence, and also Kerbal alarm clock by default sets everything to be a minute ahead.
So as I tinker fruitlessly around with my maneuver node that is properly oriented, I don't realize at the time, but this is for the unstaged vessel, meaning once I actually drop my probe, I need to recreate this maneuver node. However, I do make the executive decision once I finally get this maneuver node ready, and I stage out my probe, as we will see right here. I make the executive decision to remove this space debris, since there's absolutely no way that I can bring it back with me and or recover any of the parts. And due to that, I might as well get rid of all of the space debris rather than let it float off aimlessly into space. And skipping some time, after we already have our other vessel en route to crash, we activate our engine for the probe and start our burn so that we can get in a nice capture orbit. But before we can finalize our orbit, we have other things to attend to, such as a falling vessel about to crash, and we land on top of one of Minmus's taller mountains. As you can see, it's several kilometers above sea level or the flat salt beds on Minmus, and we'll disable the UI for a scenic view of this thing exploding. However, it is not a clean explosion, as several little parts do manage to fly away and will probably despawn at some point in the near future. So back to the second probe, we reach our periapsis and start slowing down into our finalized polar orbit. So this brings us to the end of episode 3 of my Kerbal Kareer. I thank you all for watching. Next time we'll start off with a launch from my new lunar lander, and there'll be an additional surprise to go along with that mission. This is PTTGRW, signing out.